We're still on the topic of refuge, and out of the main points of refuge, we've covered the causes, which are fear and faith. With respect to faith, one cultivates it by having an understanding of what the qualities of the three jewels are. We'll get into those later. We're currently on the topic within refuge of the objects to whom or which we go to refuge. So within that, the first outline, let's say, is the reasons why these actual refuges are worthy of going to refuge. So for example, what are the three jewels to whom we go to refuge, and why are they worthy of refuge? That's what we're going to be talking about. What is refuge? What does it mean? What are things that we take refuge in? And how do we do it? Well, taking refuge is a thought, right? It's a placing of your hopes in another. And based on placing your hopes in another, then your speech and actions change based on that. So, for example, take a poor beggar on the side of the road. They place their hopes in whomever passes by, hoping that they might give them some money. A small child places their hopes in their parents, right? And the parents have a duty to protect that child. If they go to work, they must leave their child in the care of another and make sure that they are safe. A small child is scared when their mother or father is not around, but content when they are and they feel that protection around them. A person who is freezing cold places their hope in warmth. Right? They take refuge in warmth. A patient takes refuge and places their hopes in their doctor, right? Refuge means placing your hopes in another when you do not have the capacity to solve your own situation, right? To take care of yourself in a certain situation. The different religious traditions go for refuge to different things, right? There are more animistic traditions or traditions involved with nature or nature spirits that take refuge in spirits that reside in rocks or trees or mountains and so forth. In the Hindu tradition, they go for refuge to Brahma or Indra and so on and so forth. And likewise, in other theistic traditions, they'll go for refuge to God. But in the Buddhist tradition, we go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But why? Why do we go for refuge to these three? Well, if your goal is to accomplish some sort of minor worldly aim, you can go to refuge in something else, in a worldly god, for example, to help you out with that. But since our main job in Buddhism is to achieve liberation, that requires a suitable refuge to achieve that. And in Buddhism, that is the three jewels. It is all three, Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. It is incorrect to only take refuge in the Buddha or only take refuge in the Dharma or likewise only in the Sangha. One must take refuge in all three. As Chandrakirti says in his 70 verses of refuge, that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the refuge for those who desire liberation. Who is the Buddha that we go to refuge in? A lot of people are under the impression that it is the Buddha Shakyamuni of 2,500 years ago, right? The one who came to earth and taught the Dharma, right? This idea of the Buddha that we all know, but that's not enough in this case. That's not what is meant entirely by going for refuge in the Buddha. So then, how should we understand this concept of the Buddha that we go to refuge in? Well, we can understand it based on Dignaga's verse of homage in his compendium of valid cognition, in his Pramana Samuccaya. Dignaga said, I prostrate to the one who has become an authority, who wishes to benefit beings, the teacher, the Sugata, and the protector. So Dignaga said that he prostrates to the one who has become an authority. So how is it that the Buddha enacts our welfare? He does so by teaching us the Dharma, by which we put into practice, and in doing so, we achieve liberation ourselves. He does not behave like the God of other theistic traditions who admits us into a state of salvation if we behave a certain way, right? He has become an authority because he has abandoned all faults and he knows every reality, right? But also, what does it mean to become an authority? Because Dignaga doesn't just say he is an authority, he says he has become one, which implies a process of transformation. So therefore, the Buddha wasn't always a Buddha since beginningless time. Before he was enlightened, he was also a sentient being just like us. So then how did he become an object of our prostration? Well, it was through his immense effort over eons that he then became a Buddha, to which we now go for refuge. Why is it that we are not Buddhas like him? Why are we left behind in samsara? Well, that is due to our self-cherishing and our apprehension of a self, right? For this reason, we are left behind and we remain here. And so the reality of Buddha Shakyamuni was the same as ours before he was enlightened. He became a Buddha through his efforts. And likewise, if we put in the same effort, we will also become a Buddha and therefore also become an authority. So the Buddha became an authority, but how did he do so? Well, Dignaga expresses that in this very verse. He says, I prostrate to the one who has become an authority, who wishes to benefit beings, who is a teacher, a sugata, and a protector. So these 4 points of him wishing to benefit beings, being a teacher, a sugata, and a protector, in fact, indicate how he has become an authority for us. So starting with the first point, that he wishes to benefit sentient beings. Dignaga is indicating that the Buddha has great love and great compassion. He has habituated himself to that. What is great compassion? What is its measure? Well, think about how much we love ourselves, our own existence in a sense, more in the sense of how self-centered we are and self-focused. Well, a bodhisattva's love and compassion for others is even greater than that. It's greater than how much we are obsessed with ourselves, right? Our obsession or love for ourselves is such that it can end up in a process of harm, right? We can harm ourselves out of our obsession with ourselves, right? To the point we even end our own lives, for example. But a bodhisattva's great love and compassion will never bring about any such harm. It only brings about benefit, right? So such is the noble thought that the Buddha had accustomed himself to. But it's not enough to become a Buddha or an authority just through having a good heart, right? One also needs the remaining qualities that Dignaga indicates that he is a teacher. And what is meant by a teacher here is that he realizes selflessness. And not only that, to become a Buddha, one needs to be a sugata, or one gone to bliss. So what is that really getting at here? What does that mean here? Well, to be a sugata means that you have accomplished your own welfare. You have perfected all you need to do to satisfy your own aims, which is abandon all faults and perfect all qualities. And then through that, one becomes a protector for others. So how does one protect others? Through having abandoned all faults and perfected all of one's own qualities? By teaching others the Four Noble Truths through one's own experience, not having to rely on the explanations of another teacher or having to read another book to know how to explain it, but through one's own realizations, one can then teach others, and therefore the Buddha is a protector. So, although Dignaga's verse of homage is to Buddha Shakyamuni, in essence, it is to all Buddhas of the three times, right? Our object of refuge when we say I go to refuge through the Buddha is not just Buddha Shakyamuni alone, but the Buddhas of the past, of the present, and who are yet to come. So it's very easy to give a simple explanation of how Buddha Shakyamuni, for example, became a Buddha by saying he fully habituated himself with great compassion, right? He habituated himself with it until it was perfected, and likewise, he perfected his habituation of the realization of emptiness, and then somehow along the way, he became a Buddha, right? That's a very simple explanation, but of course, there is much more depth and clarity that can be given to the process of how one becomes a Buddha. And having said that, it's very difficult to understand it with extreme depth and clarity. But for you guys, it's important that you pay attention to such a point when it's being explained, and you make an effort from your own side to read up about it, right? The path to Buddhahood. And if you familiarize with yourself with it over time, you will eventually understand it, of course. So, also to fundamentally explain all of that, one needs to accept past and future lives and karmic causality. In traditional Buddhist societies, people have no trouble accepting that. They are brought up accepting that, right? They'll easily tell you that past and future lives exist, and likewise, they'll constantly talk about karma. But they don't necessarily say these things out of any proper understanding of the concepts, right? If we start first with past and future lives, science is, well, some scientists are interested in the topic. Maybe they're not exactly focusing research on other lifetimes, right, in particular, but at least they're looking at consciousness these days. Which is good because a lot of the treatises that spend pages trying to prove past and future lifetimes actually are doing so assuming that the person that they're trying to prove it to already believes that consciousness exists, right? So they don't actually try to prove consciousness in the greater Buddhist treatise because it's just assumed that everybody sort of believes in it. But actually, we should take a step back and examine our belief in consciousness, right? So let's think about this topic of past and future lives, or let's talk about previous lifetimes. It's apparent that some people remember their previous lives, right? There's a lot of research about that. People have published a lot of books about that that you've definitely heard of that seem to prove that these people have had undisputable memories of their previous lifetimes. Okay, well, if they remembered their previous lives, they had to remember that experience through consciousness, right? Memory is not attached to your body, or your brain, right? It's not a faculty, a physical faculty, right? Memory must come from consciousness, right? And a consciousness that was a continuum that went back to a previous lifetime, right? So simply said, if you can remember your past life, then your past life exists. On the other hand, most people don't remember their past lives. But you can't say something doesn't exist because somebody doesn't remember it. For example, a lot of us can't even remember the conversations we had this morning, right? So purely from not remembering something, it doesn't disprove it. Okay, so if we can accept previous lifetimes, it also doesn't make sense to negate future lifetimes, right? It makes sense that they would also exist in this continuum. And then we have to look at the topic of the brain and linking consciousness to the brain fundamentally. If it were such that consciousness was inherently linked to the brain, then it doesn't make sense that after clinical death, you could have these practitioners that meditate in a state of tukdam, as we Tibetans call it, right? There are many such documented instances of those great practitioners who have died and remained in tukdam where their bodies do not decompose, they stay in a pristine state, they do not smell, and they stay in this state for up to like 3 weeks, maybe 27, 28 days. There are a few accounts from Gaden Shartse monastery, for example. Even one Geshe who came here to this center, Geshe Tobge, he remained in tukdam for many days. And likewise, there was another Geshe who stayed in tukdam for around 17, 18, 19 days, something like that. So science is yet to offer an explanation for this. They don't deny it, but the research is currently underway to explain this phenomenon. So if I tell a small story about this from uh, something that I'm familiar with. You all know Khentul Rinpoche, Lati Rinpoche, right? And Lati Rinpoche passed away, and he currently has a Yangtze, a reincarnation, who is being brought up in the monastery. So there's some stories about his attendant who went to retrieve Lati Rinpoche from his small village. So his attendant went to this small isolated village and met the child, right? Lati Rinpoche's Yangtze. And the child seemed to be immediately fond of him, immediately attached to him. And from that point on, wasn't really concerned about his parents anymore, right? Normally a child of that age would be really shy. They would be, hiding next to their parents and, shy to interact with this stranger. But immediately he wanted to sleep in the same room as the attendant and not with his parents. And when the parents delivered him to the monastery and left to go back to the village, Lati Rinpoche's Yangtze didn't cry or make a fuss. And that's an interesting story because when we explain such a phenomenon, we as Buddhists can only do so through talking about imprints, right? This potential that's deposited in our consciousness, right? As a process of karmic causality, we develop these imprints from our past lives. Otherwise, how would we even explain what happened with Lati Rinpoche's Yangtze, right? Explain his behavior. Right, if you think about children from really small, isolated villages who have never really interacted with anyone from outside the village, they're usually pretty poorly behaved, right? They're super shy, they get upset easily, they shout a lot, right? They're quite poorly behaved while they're young. But it was the complete opposite with this child. So one has to think how to explain that. So why do I even bring this up? Well, it's to sort of explain how consciousness is separate from form, right? Consciousness by nature is clear and knowing. And through understanding the nature of consciousness, you can prove the existence of previous lives, right? When you die, you leave your body behind and you change to a new one, but your consciousness continues. And it's explained in Buddhism that along with your consciousness comes your black and white karma, right? Or to say it in another way, faults and good qualities follow you from lifetime to lifetime. They come together with consciousness. So through understanding this, we can explain why people remember their past lives. And you can also explain phenomenon like tukdam after people die, right? As for tukdam, when you die, and this goes for everybody, your coarse consciousness ceases and you go through a process of manifesting your most subtle consciousness. For those people, they maintain that state of having a subtle consciousness before it leaves the body. They maintain it. And if they're a high level practitioner, they can use it to realize emptiness. Or if not that, then maybe they can maintain faith in the three jewels or faith in one's lama after death with this subtle consciousness, right? There are different levels of tukdam. They're not all equal. It's simply referring to a meditation process after death using a subtle consciousness. So these phenomenon prove previous lives and karmic causality. So all of this talk was to help introduce you to what a Buddha actually is, right? So now you understand that a Buddha is someone who has eliminated all faults and perfected all qualities, and not through luck, but through a lot of effort. And through understanding this, we can understand how ourselves and all other sentient beings too are likewise capable of that. So then we move on to the Dharma jewel. And having faith in the Buddha jewel seems to be a bit easier, but it's also the case that if you have faith in the Buddha jewel, it will easily lead to faith in the Dharma jewel and the Sangha jewel, and I'll tell you why. Because once you understand how a Buddha comes about, comes into being, you understand that it's through a process of practicing the Dharma, right? So the Dharma is what the Buddha teaches us skillfully, right? He taught according to the level of his audience, according to their interests and dispositions, not like any teacher of a worldly subject who just teaches at one level to a class full of different people. Rather, the Buddha is renowned as skillful in his mode of teaching. So if you understand the Dharma that he taught, then you understand the Sangha, who are those who practice it, and it's easier to have faith in them, right? The Sangha are the practitioners of the Dharma. If you think about how much effort we put into growing a beautiful flower, right? First, we take care to plant it into ready soil. And then when it sprouts, we protect it, hoping that it will one day turn into the most beautiful flower. Well, the Sangha are the same. They plant this seed of Buddhahood and they nurture it and protect it. So it makes sense that we should have respect and faith towards someone who is so focused on achieving Buddhahood. So the other day when I brought up the Four Jewels, we only covered the first two, the truth of suffering and its origins. I didn't get to talk about the true cessations and true paths because it made sense that I would leave it till now. So when we discuss what the Dharma jewel actually is, of course, we understand the Dharma to be that which the Buddha taught, right? Verbally. But in essence, the actual Dharma jewel are the true paths and true cessations out of the Four Noble Truths. What are true cessations and true paths? In our minds, we have certain faults. We have faults of attachment, anger, pride, and so on. What eliminates those faults is true paths. And when those faults have been eliminated firmly to the point that they don't return, one has achieved a true cessation. So how does a true path eliminate the three poisons, for example? Right? Normally we hear that when we have a lot of attachment, we should meditate on the unpleasant aspect of that person or object we are attached to. Or if we're really angry, we should try to cultivate love as an antidote. But these antidotes only reduce the strength of those afflictions. They don't eliminate them from the root. It's like cutting the branch of a tree rather than severing it at the root. So how do you eliminate the afflictions from their root? Well, first you have to understand that their root is a misunderstanding of the reality of things, right? Essentially, the apprehension of a self. So we need to oppose the apprehension of a self with a realization of selflessness. And by doing so, you uproot all the afflictions, whether attachment, anger, greed, and so forth. But it's not enough just to realize selflessness. You need to meditate on the conceptual realization of it until it slowly turns into a clear realization, right? A direct realization of selflessness, which can then actually uproot the apprehension of a self. So once that has been uprooted, you achieve a true cessation. Okay, so what is the Sangha or the Sangha jewel? In common parlance, when we say Sangha, we get the impression it refers to a group of monks, and therefore some people think to determine whether someone is a Sangha jewel or not, one needs to determine if they're actually a monastic or not. But that's not the case. Even a layperson can be a Sangha jewel because a Sangha jewel is someone who possesses a true cessation or a true path in their continuum. Right? So if whoever has such a quality is a Sangha jewel. For example, one of the main forefathers of the Kadampa tradition, Dromdampa, he is an illustration of a Sangha jewel, right? And he wasn't a monk. Neither was Marpa, neither was Milarepa. So here, in the context of the three jewels, the Sangha jewel does not refer to someone who has entered a monastery, changed their name, cut their hair, and wears robes. Right? Even a layperson can be a Sangha jewel if they have a true path or true cessation. But then how does this understanding and refuge in the three jewels translate into a practice of refuge? Well, it's developed such that a practice of refuge also encompasses the following. For example, recognizing that a Buddha is that which is free of all faults and perfect, has perfected all qualities, we also need to worship and respect and clean Buddha's statues, right? A Buddha's image, out of respect for the Buddha jewel. And likewise, even though we know that the actual Dharma jewel are true cessations and paths, we also need to respect the scriptures, the physical scriptures that teach these things, right? That's a practice of refuge. And likewise, one practices refuge in the Sangha by showing respect towards monks and nuns, right? By discriminating that they are actual Sangha jewels and respecting them in that way. So I've given a brief explanation of what the Buddha jewel and the Dharma jewel is, but I haven't given a perfect, extensive explanation. So you should not be satisfied with what I have told you now. And nor should you just leave it there and move on to another topic. I want you to explore this topic further. I want you to read up about it in your own time. I want you to ask questions about it, right? What is the nature of the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, the Sangha jewel, and so forth? Because it's very important to understand this. As Chandrakirti said in his 70 verses of refuge that I cited before, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are the refuge for those who desire liberation. So, what we can extrapolate from this is that if we wish to achieve a smaller aim below liberation, something more worldly, that it's okay if we don't go for refuge in all the three jewels. Like, for example, just taking refuge in an Arya being, which would constitute refuge in the Sangha. Or just taking refuge in the Buddha, for example, by reciting a Dharani mantra to accomplish a goal. I know of many practices in Dharma centers in the West, for example, or in Asia, where they focus principally on a deity like Amitabha, right, to extend their lifespan, or on the medicine Buddha to cure an illness, even to cure cancer, or on a Tara practice to induce luck, right? And they recite the mantras of these Buddhas to achieve those more worldly goals below liberation. And I have heard that in some cases there have been such results. I've read a book that talked about a person who did who recited the Amitabha mantra and extended their lifespan by like 6 or 7 years when they were apparently supposed to die. So even if you're not going for refuge for the purpose of enlightenment, then it seems to be acceptable that for achieving temporary worldly goals, going for refuge to one out of the three jewels is acceptable in certain instances, as I just said. So we're pretty much out of time. And in this section on the reasons why the three jewels are worthy of our refuge, there are 4 outlines, but I'm not going to go into those 4 because we don't have the time. So instead, I'd like to finish the lesson by teaching you a meditation practice on the Buddha's body, the Buddha's image. So I've explained the objects of refuge, the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha. And in the previous class, I went over the causes for going for refuge to them, which were fear and faith. And I said in that class that you really need to feel it, right? You need to have a strong feeling of fear and faith in order to affect an authentic mind of refuge. So now, in this lesson, to get an understanding of the three jewels, you primarily do that through studying their qualities and so forth. It's not really about affecting a feeling as before. So instead of trying to bring about some sort of feeling, what we do now is meditate on the image of the Buddha, for example, as an extension of our refuge in the three jewels. So this is a practice that is best done in the morning after you wake up, but after you've washed your face and if you're so inclined, you've done your exercise, because you should be feeling fresh, right? You shouldn't be feeling drowsy. So you should sit in a quiet place, and it shouldn't be at a time where it's noisy around you, especially where people are chatting and you can hear the sound of their voices or even what they're saying, because that's said to be one of the greatest obstacles to meditation. So then when you sit, your body shouldn't be tight, right? You should let it relax. And then now you think of the Buddha's image. So how does one do that? Well, first, we need to talk about the height that you think of the Buddha in front of you. So it should be at the level of your eyebrows in front of you. And you're going to imagine the Buddha is sitting on a throne. It's said that if you imagine the Buddha sitting on a throne is too high, then it leads to mental distraction. And if you visualize the Buddha too low, it leads to a feeling of lethargy or drowsiness. So you need to get the height right? So just in front of you at the level of your eyebrows. But what distance should the Buddha be from yourself in your imagination? You should imagine that the Buddha on the throne is at the distance where if you were to make a full prostration with your body and your hands extended, you would touch the foot of the throne, right? You would reach him with your fingers, right? So that's the distance. So as for the image of the Buddha, there are many resources for you to get an idea. You can look on Google, right? You can look it up on the internet and see a valid picture of the Buddha and familiarize yourself with that, right? Look at it many times and then try to imagine it. But don't fall into the trap of only looking at 2D flat images, because then in your imagination, the Buddha will also be like a 2D flat image, like in a tanka. So you don't want that. And likewise, if you're only looking at statues, then when you imagine the Buddha, you might think that you might imagine a Buddha that is very concrete, right? Physically, which you also don't want to do. So instead, in your imagination, you want to visualize a Buddha that is human in form, but not made of flesh and bone and blood like us, but rather in the nature of light. However, having said that he should be visualized in the nature of light, you should also imagine that he has some sort of weight, like a little bit of heaviness about him, right? So he's in the nature of light, like a rainbow. And these days, you see all sorts of beautiful lights that people put up in their houses and so forth that shine all sorts of beautiful colors, something like that, right? So if you imagine that this Buddha in the nature of light is a little bit heavy, a little bit weighted, it can stop you getting distracted. So I can't give an in-depth explanation of all the reasons for every part of the visualization because we don't have the time, but just understand that the explanation I am giving is a lineage of instruction that has come down from the lamas and can also be found in the texts like the lamrim treatises. Okay, so you've got a rough idea of what to visualize. So when you visualize that Buddha, don't try too hard, don't strain yourself to see it. If you do so, you can get what is called lung, which is a medical condition of the body, mental, physical condition. And you don't want to do that. So don't strain yourself. Okay, so we said nature of light, a little bit weighted to stop distraction. And now that we're running out of time, I would have liked if people could ask questions now, but obviously I haven't left you any time. So I will make more time for that in the next class. But for today, it's not going to happen. So again, look at pictures, especially for the throne that the Buddha sits on and so forth, and then induce a sense of faith. Right? Imagine that the Buddha is sort of radiating light and that he's in the process of teaching the Dharma, and that the Dharma he's teaching you understand. So habituate yourself with this visualization. If you do that again and again and again, since you're a Buddhist, then when you encounter problems in your life, this is going to be a thought that automatically comes to you, right? You're automatically going to put your hopes in the Dharma and the Buddha, and you're going to remember this meditation. Not only that, through practicing such a meditation, you accumulate great waves of merit. And I want to explain that a bit more in another class, right? The great merit that you can accumulate. Okay, so to summarize again, the height at the level of the eyebrows, the distance is the distance of your own body making a full prostration. Likewise, in the space that you're meditating, it's better if it's not cluttered with all sorts of objects because that can be quite distracting. And likewise, your eyes shouldn't be fully closed so that you have a sense of darkness because then you'll become lethargic. So you should have your eyes slightly open in a relaxed way to induce some clarity. Right, so if you imagine this again and again, it just gets easier and easier and easier if you do it. So this meditation is also good because even if your refuge is not super firm and super solid based on in-depth understanding, this can help you with your level of basic faith, right? Which is already something, and it's already quite an accomplishment to have this basic sense of faith in the Buddha. Okay, so now you're probably all really tired. You've had a long day. A lot of you have come from work. So I thank you for making the effort to come, and I'll finish it here. And I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody.